Picture this. It's bedtime, and you're reading your child that familiar story about a little girl in a red hood who meets a talking wolf in the forest. Sweet, innocent, perfectly safe for children. But what if I told you that the story you're reading was originally designed to terrify medieval communities into keeping their daughters alive? Little Red Riding Hood isn't a fairy tale at all. It's a survival guide disguised as a children's story, a medieval Amber Alert system wrapped in pretty packaging by centuries of sanitization. Behind that cheerful red cape lies one of Europe's most documented and terrifying serial killing sprees. The story we know today, with its talking wolf, heroic woodsman, and happy ending, is a heavily sanitized version of accounts that once served as genuine warnings about predators who stalked forest paths, hunting young women with baskets. The original versions contained no magical elements, no anthropomorphic animals, and certainly no happy endings. They were police reports disguised as folklore. You're about to learn that Little Red Riding Hood was inspired by real events that terrorized 18th century France, that the Big Bad Wolf was based on documented attacks by both animals and humans, that the grandmother's house represented actual safe houses where communities tried to protect vulnerable family members, and that the Red Hood itself served a specific survival purpose that modern versions have completely obscured. We'll journey through the Beast of Gévaudan, attacks that killed over 100 people in medieval France, explore how serial killers used the exact tactics described in the fairy tale, examine the real-world context of why young girls carried food through dangerous forests, and discover how this innocent bedtime story was actually medieval Europe's most effective crime prevention program. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting fairy tales, they were documenting survival strategies that had kept communities alive for centuries. Between 1764 and 1767, something began systematically hunting the people of south-central France. This wasn't folklore or legend, it was documented, investigated, and reported across Europe as one of the most terrifying predator attacks in recorded history. The French called it La Bête du Gévaudan, the Beast of Gévaudan. Court records and eyewitness testimonies describe a wolf-like creature the size of a calf, with reddish fur, an enormous head, and jaws powerful enough to decapitate a human with one bite. But what made this creature truly terrifying wasn't its size, it was its intelligence. Unlike normal wolves that kill for food, this predator seemed to hunt strategically, targeting lone travelers, especially women and children walking isolated forest paths. The beast had a specific methodology that mirrors the Little Red Riding Hood story with chilling accuracy. It would stalk victims for miles, wait for them to be completely isolated, then attack with surgical precision, often going straight for the throat or head. Multiple documented attacks involved young girls between 8 and 16 years old who were walking forest paths to deliver food, medicine, or supplies to relatives. Exactly the scenario we know from the fairy tale. Marie-Jeanne Vallée, age 19, fought off the beast with a spear when it attacked her while she was carrying food to her family. Her detailed court testimony describes the exact scenario from Little Red Riding Hood: a lone girl, a basket of provisions, a forest path, and a predator that seemed almost human in its cunning. Survivors consistently reported that the creature would study its prey before attacking, appeared to enjoy the terror it caused, and showed intelligence that seemed supernatural to medieval minds. King Louis XV was so disturbed by the reports that he sent his best hunters and offered massive rewards for the creature's capture. The attacks became international news, with newspapers across Europe following the story. Entire regions lived in terror, afraid to let children walk anywhere alone. The beast's reign of terror only ended when local hunter Jean Chastel killed what appeared to be an unusually large wolf in 1767. The original versions of Little Red Riding Hood, particularly Charles Perrault's 1697 version, contain far more graphic violence than Disney adaptations suggest. In Perrault's telling, the wolf tricks the girl into eating her grandmother's flesh and drinking her blood before devouring her alive. There's no heroic woodsman, no happy ending, just predation and consumption. This version reflects the reality of medieval wolf attacks and the genuine terror they inspired. The Beast of Gévaudan wasn't isolated. Church records across medieval Europe document hundreds of verified wolf attacks on humans. These weren't rabid animals or starving predators. They were healthy wolves that had developed a taste for human flesh and learned to hunt people systematically. The big bad wolf wasn't a metaphor. It was a documented threat that required specific survival strategies. Serial killers, using fairy tale tactics. While the Beast of Gévaudan terrorized France, human predators across Europe were using remarkably similar hunting strategies. Court records from the 16th through 18th centuries document multiple cases of what we would now recognize as serial killers who specifically targeted young women carrying supplies through isolated areas. Between 1520 and 1630, European courts conducted over 30 werewolf trials, legal proceedings against individuals accused of transforming into wolves and attacking humans. While supernatural transformation was obviously impossible, these trials documented real cases of individuals who had developed systematic methods for hunting and killing people in remote areas. Many used wolf pelts or masks to disguise themselves and terrify victims. In 1589, Peter Stump was executed in Germany for crimes that directly parallel the Little Red Riding Hood narrative. Court records detail how he would disguise himself, stalk young women travelling alone with food or supplies, attack them on forest paths, and consume parts of their bodies. His confession, extracted under torture, described over 16 murders spanning 2 decades. Local communities had been warning their daughters about a wolfman for years before his capture. In 1573, French authorities executed Gilles Garnier for similar crimes. His documented attacks specifically targeted children and young women carrying food between villages. Garnier would hide near forest paths, attack victims when they were isolated, and often consume parts of their bodies. His trial testimony reveals that he had studied wolf behavior to improve his hunting techniques. The iconic Red Hood served a specific survival function that modern versions ignore. Bright red fabric was expensive and highly visible, serving multiple protective purposes. It made the wearer easy to spot from a distance, helping searchers locate missing persons. Identified the wearer as belonging to a specific family or community, deterring attacks on protected individuals, and could be used as a signaling device, waved to attract help or warn others of danger. Medieval communities developed elaborate safety systems for protecting young people who needed to travel through dangerous areas. These included traveling only during specific daylight hours, following predetermined routes that were regularly patrolled, carrying specific items that could be used as weapons or signals, and maintaining verbal passwords that could identify legitimate community members versus potential threats. The grandmother's house in the fairy tale represents a real medieval safety strategy. Elderly family members, especially women, often lived in remote locations where they could serve as early warning systems for approaching threats. These houses were positioned strategically along travel routes and stocked with supplies for emergency situations. Young people traveling through dangerous areas would stop at these safe houses to rest, resupply, and gather information about current threats. The fairy tale format served as an efficient method for transmitting survival information across communities with low literacy rates. Stories could be memorized easily, contained multiple layers of practical information, and could be modified to reflect current local threats. The Little Red Riding Hood story functioned as a medieval podcast, updating communities about predator tactics, successful survival strategies, and areas to avoid. Contemporary criminal psychology recognizes the tactics described in Little Red Riding Hood as classic predator behavior, targeting vulnerable individuals in isolated locations, using deception to gain trust, exploiting the victim's sense of obligation to help others, and choosing locations where victims are unlikely to receive help. The fairy tale's warning about not trusting strangers who ask too many questions about your destination remains relevant today. Medieval European forests weren't the enchanted woodlands of Disney imagination. They were genuinely dangerous places where normal social rules didn't apply. These vast wilderness areas served as hideouts for bandits, escaped criminals, political refugees, and individuals who had been exiled from their communities. Traveling through forests, especially alone, was essentially entering a lawless zone where murder, robbery, and rape were constant threats. Court records from across medieval Europe document sophisticated criminal networks operating from forest bases. These weren't random highwaymen, they were organized groups with established territories, communication systems, and specific target preferences. Many specialized in attacking travelers, carrying valuable goods, including young women transporting food, medicine, or trade goods between communities. Young women carrying supplies were particularly attractive targets because they typically traveled predictable routes on regular schedules, carried valuable goods, food was expensive in medieval times, had limited physical capability to resist attacks, and often came from families with resources worth ransoming. Criminal organizations would study these patterns and position themselves along commonly used paths. French court archives contain dozens of cases involving individuals who systematically attacked young women on forest paths. One particularly well-documented case from 1643 involves Claude Morel, who spent 3 years attacking girls aged 12-18 who were travelling between villages with food supplies. His methodology exactly matches the Little Red Riding Hood pattern. Disguise himself as a harmless traveller, ask about the victim's destination and purpose, follow them to isolated areas, then attack. The basket in Little Red Riding Hood wasn't arbitrary. It represented a specific vulnerability. Baskets indicated that the carrier was transporting valuable goods, suggested they were following a predictable route to deliver those goods, and physically handicapped the carrier's ability to run or fight effectively. Predators learned to specifically target individuals carrying baskets or bundles. Forest attacks followed predictable seasonal patterns that communities learned to anticipate. Spring brought increased travel as people emerged from winter isolation. Summer meant extended daylight hours that encouraged longer journeys. Autumn involved intensive gathering and preservation activities that required forest travel, and winter created desperate conditions that drove more criminals into the wilderness. Medieval communities developed sophisticated systems for reducing forest travel risks. These included organized group travel schedules where multiple families would coordinate trips, armed escort services provided by young men in exchange for community support, alternative route planning that avoided known danger zones, and communication networks that could warn about recent threats or suspicious individuals. The forest path in Little Red Riding Hood represents the fundamental medieval dilemma of necessary risk. Young people, especially women, often had no choice but to travel through dangerous areas to maintain family relationships, economic activities, and community obligations. The fairy tale acknowledges this reality while providing practical guidance for minimizing risks. The grandmother's cottage represents a real medieval institution, isolated safe houses maintained by communities along dangerous travel routes. These locations were stocked with emergency supplies, positioned to provide maximum visibility of approaching travelers, and typically inhabited by individuals who could provide early warning about threats. Elder women were often chosen for this role because they were considered less threatening by potential predators and more likely to be left alone. Medieval travelers learned to time their journeys carefully to minimize exposure to both environmental and human threats. Early morning travel provided maximum daylight for the return journey, avoided afternoon periods when predators were most active, and allowed time to reach safety before dark. Weather conditions that reduced visibility or made travel difficult also increased the risk of predator encounters. Historical records suggest that many of the grandmothers in these isolated cottages weren't actually elderly family members. They were community-appointed guardians, often women who had survived their own traumatic encounters with forest predators. Their role was to provide sanctuary, gather intelligence about threats, and serve as the final warning system for travelers approaching truly dangerous areas. Little Red Riding Hood wasn't entertainment. It was medieval Europe's most sophisticated crime prevention program. The story format allowed communities to transmit crucial survival information across generations, update tactics based on current threats, and ensure that even young children understood the specific dangers they might face and the strategies they needed to survive. The wide distribution of the Little Red Riding Hood story served a secondary purpose. It informed potential predators that communities were aware of their tactics and had developed countermeasures. The story's popularity essentially announced that young women would be alert to specific warning signs, communities were actively protecting potential victims, and successful attacks would trigger organized responses. Different versions of Little Red Riding Hood emerged across Europe, each adapted to reflect local threats and survival strategies. Italian versions emphasized the importance of staying on established paths, German versions focused on identifying disguised predators, French versions warned about individuals who asked too many questions about travel plans, and English versions stressed the importance of community support networks. The transformation of Little Red Riding Hood from medieval crime prevention tool to children's entertainment began in the 17th century as European societies became more urbanized and centralized. Charles Perrault's 1697 version removed the most graphic violence while maintaining the core warnings. The Brothers Grimm further sanitized the story in 1812, adding the heroic woodsman and happy ending that characterize modern versions. Each sanitization removed crucial survival information that had helped medieval communities protect their children. The original versions contained specific details about predator behavior, effective resistance strategies, community support systems, and the genuine consequences of ignoring safety protocols. Modern versions retain only vague warnings about stranger danger, without the practical guidance that made the original story effective. Contemporary criminal psychology confirms that many predator tactics described in the original Little Red Riding Hood remain current. Individuals who target young women still use isolation strategies, deception techniques, and exploitation of social obligations to gain access to victims. The story's warnings about trusting individuals who show excessive interest in your destination, schedule, or family situation remain relevant. The Red Hood itself became a powerful symbol of awareness and resistance. Its bright color represented visibility and alertness. Its covering suggested protection and preparation, and its association with the story served as a cultural code that reminded communities about the need for constant vigilance. Young women wearing red were signaling their awareness of potential threats. The Little Red Riding Hood story demonstrates how pre-literate societies used narrative structures to preserve and transmit critical information. The story format made complex safety information memorable. The emotional content ensured the lessons would be taken seriously, and the flexibility of oral tradition allowed communities to update the story based on evolving threats. The widespread knowledge of predator tactics described in Little Red Riding Hood influenced medieval legal systems and social customs. Courts began recognizing specific patterns of predatory behavior. Communities developed formal protocols for protecting travelers, and families established safety procedures that reflected the story's warnings. The greatest irony of Little Red Riding Hood's evolution is that by making the story safe for children, we eliminated its actual safety value. The sanitized version fails to prepare young people for real dangers, removes the practical guidance that could save lives, and transforms a sophisticated survival tool into passive entertainment. Understanding Little Red Riding Hood's true origins doesn't mean traumatizing children with graphic medieval violence. Instead, it means recognizing that the story's core message, that young people face real dangers from predators who use specific tactics, that communities must actively protect vulnerable members, and that awareness and preparation are essential for survival. It remains as relevant today as it was in medieval forests. Modern societies still struggle with protecting young people from predators who use isolation, deception, and exploitation of trust to gain access to victims. Little Red Riding Hood's original purpose, teaching specific recognition and resistance strategies, could be adapted for contemporary threats while maintaining age-appropriate presentation. Little Red Riding Hood's transformation from medieval crime prevention tool to sanitized children's story reflects our broader cultural tendency to deny uncomfortable realities about human predation. By understanding the story's true origins, we can appreciate both the ingenuity of medieval communities in protecting their children and the importance of maintaining realistic awareness about ongoing threats. The Red Hood's true legacy isn't magical fantasy, it's the recognition that survival requires knowledge, preparation, and community support.